On January 20th, 2026, something unprecedented happened in the Swiss Alps. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before the World Economic Forum in Davos and declared that the rules-based international order was a pleasant fiction, and that fiction had come to an end. The room fell silent. Then came something rarely seen at Davos, a standing ovation. Harvard Kennedy School professor Graham Allison said the speech captured what a big majority of NATO and European leaders were thinking but weren't saying out loud. Writer James Fallows compared its significance to George Marshall's historic 1947 speech that launched the Marshall Plan. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. This isn't just about one speech. In the weeks surrounding Carney's Davos address, former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper publicly warned that Canada must impose reciprocal tariffs on the United States. Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced a multi-billion-dollar strategy to protect Canada's auto sector and 500,000 jobs. International leaders from Finland to NATO headquarters praised Canada's new direction. I'm Nora Blake, and you're watching Nora Blake Reports. If you want to understand how Canada is responding to the biggest shift in North American relations in generations, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. The question everyone is asking is simple. What exactly is happening between Canada and the United States? And why is this moment different from every other trade dispute we've seen before? To understand where we are, we need to understand what Canada has been facing. Since November 2024, Donald Trump has repeatedly called for Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. Trump kept saying it, again and again, through late 2024, into 2025, and even into 2026. Then came the tariffs. On March 12th, 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. But he didn't stop there. Trump threatened to permanently shut down the automobile manufacturing business in Canada, with even higher auto tariffs. Think about that. The President of the United States openly threatening to destroy an entire sector of his closest ally's economy. Canada responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. But this wasn't just about tariffs anymore. This was about something deeper. This was about sovereignty, about whether Canada would exist as an independent nation with its own economic future, or whether it would simply become an economic extension of whatever Washington decided on any given day. Mark Carney became Canada's 24th Prime Minister on March 14th, 2025, 2 days after Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs hit. The timing was not coincidental. Carney had won the Liberal Party leadership on March 9th, with an overwhelming 85.9% on the first ballot. Then he won the federal election on April 28, 2025, with a Liberal majority. Who is Mark Carney? He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England. He ran the Financial Stability Board during the global financial crisis. This is not a typical politician. This is someone who understands global finance, international institutions, and economic power at the highest levels. And from day one, Carney signaled something different. He wasn't going to manage the U.S. relationship the old way. He wasn't going to quietly accept whatever Washington demanded and hope for the best. He was going to rebuild Canada's position from the ground up. In his first 6 months as Prime Minister, Mark Carney signed 12 trade and security deals across 4 continents. 12 deals, 6 months, 4 continents. That pace is almost unheard of in Canadian diplomatic history. What was Carney doing? He was diversifying. He was building options. He was making sure that Canada's economic future didn't depend entirely on one unpredictable partner. Carney made a state visit to China in January 2026 and reached an agreement to lower tariffs on Canadian canola exports and Chinese electric vehicles. Think about the symbolism of that. While Trump was threatening Canada, Carney was in Beijing signing trade deals. While Washington was talking about making Canada the 51st state, Ottawa was expanding partnerships across Asia. This wasn't about choosing China over America. This was about having choices. This was about making sure that no single country could threaten Canada's economic sovereignty, because Canada had built relationships everywhere: Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa. Carney was playing a different game than Trump expected. Then came Davos. January 20th, 2026. Carney's speech described a rupture in the world order and called the rules-based international system a pleasant fiction that had come to an end. He didn't dance around it. He didn't use diplomatic language to soften the blow. He said directly what many leaders were thinking, but afraid to say. Carney warned about the weaponization of trade, finance, and supply chains. He was talking about Trump. Everyone in that room knew it. He was saying that the era when countries could simply trust that economic integration would continue smoothly was over. That middle powers like Canada needed to protect themselves. That dependence had become vulnerability. Finland's President Alexander Stubb called it one of the best speeches heard at Davos. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the speech showed that Canada is back as a pivotal NATO participant. Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, called it brilliant, powerful, and historic. These weren't just compliments, these were signals. Signals that Canada's closest allies understood what Carney was doing and supported it. The response from American academics was particularly telling. Harvard Kennedy School professor Graham Allison, one of America's leading experts on great power competition, said Carney's speech captured what a big majority of NATO and European leaders were thinking. Allison didn't criticize Carney, he validated him. He said Carney was articulating what everyone else was afraid to say. James Fallows, a longtime writer for The Atlantic and Harvard alumnus, compared the speech's potential significance to George Marshall's 1947 address at Harvard that introduced the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, one of the most consequential policy initiatives in modern history. That's the comparison Fallows made. Whether you agree with that comparison or not, it tells you how seriously American intellectuals were taking this moment. This matters because it shows that Carney's approach isn't being dismissed as anti-American or radical. It's being recognized as strategic realism, as an intelligent response to a changing world, even by Americans who understand power and international relations at the highest levels. Now here's where things get really interesting. Former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper spoke at an Ottawa gala in early February 2026 and called for reciprocal tariffs against the United States. Harper, a conservative, a former prime minister, someone who generally favors free markets and close ties with Washington. Harper stated clearly that one-way tariffs introduced by the U.S. must be reciprocated, and that Canada can never concede permanent one-way economic flows from Canada to the United States. This wasn't subtle. Harper was saying that if Washington imposes tariffs, Ottawa must hit back. That Canada cannot accept a relationship where America gets everything it wants and Canada gets nothing. Back in January 2025, Harper had already said that Trump's threats didn't sound like those of a friend, partner, and ally. So this wasn't a sudden shift. Harper had been critical of Trump's approach for over a year. But his February 2026 statements went further. He was openly endorsing a tougher Canadian response. Why does this matter? Because it shows that the new Canadian approach isn't just a Liberal Party position. A former Conservative Prime Minister is saying the same thing. That's significant. That suggests a broader consensus in Canadian politics than Trump might have expected. Canada's automotive sector supports over 500,000 workers, and more than 90% of Canadian-made vehicles are exported to the United States. When Trump threatened to shut down Canadian auto manufacturing, he was threatening hundreds of thousands of families. entire communities in Ontario that depend on auto plants. This wasn't an abstract trade issue. This was personal for a lot of Canadians. Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced a new multi-billion-dollar auto strategy in February 2026 designed to protect these jobs and support Toyota and Honda production in Canada. Joly stated specific goals, including building the 2029 Honda Civic in Canada and securing Toyota RAV4 and Lexus production. These weren't vague promises. These were concrete commitments to specific models and specific companies. Toyota had already invested $1.1 billion in Ontario for new RAV4 production between 2025 and 2026. So this wasn't just government talk. Companies were putting real money into Canadian manufacturing. Why? Because they saw stability. They saw predictable policy. They saw a government that was serious about supporting industrial production. Here's the question global manufacturers are asking themselves right now. Where do we build our next factory? The United States has a larger market, but it also has policy volatility. Tariffs that appear and disappear based on political calculations. Threats to allies. Unpredictability. Canada has a smaller domestic market, but it has stable policy. It has trade agreements with Europe, Asia, and throughout the Americas. It has direct access to the U.S. market through USMCA, even if that agreement is under strain. And it has a government that is actively courting manufacturing investment with clear incentives and long-term commitments. For a company deciding where to place a billion-dollar factory that will operate for 20 or 30 years, stability matters. Predictability matters. The ability to plan for the future matters. And right now, on those metrics, Canada might actually have an advantage. That's not a political statement. That's a business calculation. And businesses make those calculations very carefully. Mark Carney ran the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. He was there during Brexit. He watched the United Kingdom tear itself apart over whether to leave the European Union. He saw what happens when a country makes itself economically vulnerable based on political emotions rather than strategic calculation. Carney learned something critical from that experience. Economic sovereignty requires diversification. It requires options. It requires building relationships before you need them, not after a crisis hits. The UK discovered too late that leaving the European Union meant scrambling to build new trade relationships from a position of weakness. Carney is making sure Canada doesn't repeat that mistake. He's building relationships now. He's diversifying now. He's creating options now. So that if the relationship with the United States continues to deteriorate, Canada isn't left scrambling. Canada has alternatives already in place. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's statement that Canada is back as a pivotal NATO participant wasn't accidental. NATO is watching what's happening between Canada and the United States very carefully. European allies are watching. They're asking themselves a question. If Trump is willing to threaten Canada, America's closest ally and neighbor, what does that mean for them? Finland's president praising Carney's Davos speech sends a message. Finland just joined NATO. Finland shares a long border with Russia. Finland understands what it means to be a smaller power next to an unpredictable larger power. When Finland's president praises Canada's new strategy, that's meaningful. European leaders aren't going to publicly criticize the United States, but they can quietly signal support for Canada. They can praise Carney's speeches. They can sign trade deals with Ottawa. They can show that they understand Canada's position, and that's exactly what's happening. Carney's warning at Davos about the weaponization of trade, finance, and supply chains reflects a fundamental shift in how the global economy works. For decades, the assumption was that economic integration made conflict less likely. The countries tied together through trade would cooperate because they had shared interests. Trump has demolished that assumption. He's shown that economic integration can be a weapon, that the country with the larger market can threaten the country with the smaller market. The dependence creates vulnerability, and once that vulnerability exists, it can be exploited. Carney is responding to that reality. He's not trying to turn back the clock to some imaginary past. He's not pretending that economic nationalism doesn't exist. He's accepting the world as it is and building a strategy for how Canada survives and thrives in that world. That's what strategic realism looks like. Carney's January 2026 visit to China and the agreement on canola and electric vehicles puts Canada in a delicate position. The United States doesn't want its allies getting too close to China. But if Washington is threatening Canada economically, what exactly is Canada supposed to do? This is the bind that Trump has created. He wants Canada to align completely with American China policy. But he's also threatening Canada's core economic interests. He wants loyalty without offering partnership. He wants alignment without offering respect. That's not sustainable. Carney is showing that Canada will make its own decisions based on Canadian interests. If that means talking to China, Canada will talk to China. If that means signing trade deals that Washington doesn't like, Canada will sign those deals. Because at the end of the day, Canada has to protect Canadian workers, Canadian industries, and Canadian sovereignty. We are watching something that hasn't happened in living memory. A fundamental reimagining of the Canada-US relationship. For decades, that relationship was defined by quiet cooperation, managed disagreements, and an assumption of shared interests. That assumption is breaking down. Trump has forced Canada to ask a question that no Canadian government has wanted to ask. What if the United States is not a reliable partner? What if American policy is so volatile that Canada cannot plan based on American commitments? What if the relationship that has defined Canadian foreign policy for a century is fundamentally changing? Carney's answer is clear. Build alternatives. Create options. Don't depend on goodwill that might disappear tomorrow. It's a harder path. It requires more diplomacy, more negotiation, more complexity. But it also means that Canada controls more of its own destiny. What we're witnessing is the beginning of something, not the end. Mark Carney has been Prime Minister for less than a year. 12 trade deals in 6 months is just the start. The Davos speech in January 2026 was a statement of intent, not a final policy. The question isn't whether Canada can completely replace the American market. It can't. The question is whether Canada can build enough alternatives that it negotiates with Washington from a position of strength rather than dependence. And that's exactly what Carney is trying to do. Trump thought threatening Canada would bring quick capitulation. Instead, he's created the conditions for Canada to diversify away from American dependence. He's united figures across the Canadian political spectrum, like Stephen Harper, behind a tougher response. He's given Canada's allies a reason to support Ottawa's new direction. If you want to follow how this story develops, subscribe to Nora Blake Reports. Hit that like button if this analysis helped you understand what's happening. Drop a comment with your thoughts on Canada's new strategy. And share this video with anyone who wants to understand the biggest shift in North American relations in decades. Because this isn't just about Canada and the United States. This is about what happens when the old rules break down and countries have to figure out how to navigate a more dangerous world. And how that story plays out will affect all of us.